Thanks for joining me again. This particular lesson is called Elijah Today. And sadly, only right at the end will you see why this particular title was chosen. One of the passions that I have in Revelation is looking at the various chiasms. You remember in the second lesson, we looked at the chiasm of Revelation and how that it reflects on itself. And also, one of the other concepts that we looked at in that second lesson of the structure of Revelation, or the structure of prophetic books, was type and antitype. And you also remember in that second lesson, we looked at Daniel chapter 3. That was a type of what was going to happen in Revelation 13. If you missed that particular DVD, maybe swap them around and first have a look at number 2. But just to recap quickly, what exactly a chiasm is and the passion that I have for the chiasms of Revelation. The concept of a chiasm is specifically within Revelation. Well, Revelation has 22 chapters, and all these chapters seem to reflect down to the middle. Everything is pointing towards the middle. How does it do that? It takes verses from the beginning and the end, which are purely mirrored upon each other, and it brings them closer and still closer together. And finally, it leaves you with that central part, which is the absolute climax of Revelation, chapters 12, 13, 14, that area around there, and some of the little pieces just before and after that. And this particular lesson came out of a series that I was busy working on called The Hidden Wonders of Revelation. Because as you read it, especially if you're reading it with the Old Greek, you will notice that very often specific words are used. You don't always notice it in the English language, but in the Old Greek you start noticing little words that reflect on each other and that hint at a type and an antitype. And so it was that I stumbled across the little word hosos. It's not a word found very often. I think it's only found 3 or 4 times within all of Revelation. And the meaning of the word means as great or long as something, as much, as many, wheresoever, and wherewithsoever. So it's not a very meaningful word. It's a small little word that is just tucked away where? Well, of course, again in Revelation 13, and I found that it had a type-antitype concept from a different part of Revelation. Let's look at the 2 pieces, the 2 verses that use this word. Revelation 2 verse 22 says, "But unto you," this is the central church of the 7 churches, the church of Thyatira, the middle one. It says, "But unto you I say, and unto the rest in Thyatira, as many as have not this doctrine, and which have not known the depths of Satan, as they speak, I will put upon you none other burden." We at the same time read Revelation 13 verse 15, and it says, "And he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed." Well, just because that little word is used in both verses doesn't give us any indication that there's a reflection, that there's a meaning, that maybe there was a purpose for the same little word to be used. In fact, if you look at those verses, maybe they don't really mean much to us at all. So maybe we'll have to just scratch a little bit deeper. And that is how God's word is written. God's word is written, firstly, plain enough for a child to understand. If you are a new Christian and you read through the Bible, you will get God's message. If you are a student of the Bible, a scholar of the Bible, and as you study deeper and deeper, you discover that the Bible you can never discover all the wonders of the Bible. And so I chose to scratch just a little deeper to see if maybe there was some information that was hidden within these two verses. If we read around that first verse, Revelation 2, we read verse 20 to 24, and again I've summarized it to try and fit it into one slide. And we read the following. It says, "Notwithstanding, I have a few things against thee, because thou sufferest that woman Jezebel, which calleth herself a prophetess, to teach and to seduce my servants to commit fornication. It says, Behold, I will cast her into a bed, and them that commit adultery with her into great tribulation, and I will kill her children with death. And all the churches shall know that I am he which searcheth the reins and hearts. And I will give unto every one of you according to your works. But unto you I say, as many as have not this doctrine, and which have not known the depths of Satan, I will put upon you none other burden." This was a message captured right in the middle of the seven churches. Now let's take a look at what we found in Revelation chapter 13. And I'm taking a few verses around that verse of ours. "And they worshipped the dragon." The dragon we know is Satan. That old serpent, which is the devil and Satan. "And I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. And he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak, and cause that as many would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. And he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads." Well, maybe that's not giving us all the information we need yet. Is there a chiasm? Is there reflection within these two passages? Are we going to waste our time by scratching around or not? Let's ask a few questions. Where did the doctrine of chapter 2 originate from? Chapter 2, verse 24. "But unto you I say, and unto the rest," and speaking about the doctrine, "as many as have not this doctrine, and which have not known the depths of Satan." This doctrine originates from who? From Satan. What happened in Revelation? Revelation 13 verse 4. "And they worshipped the dragon which gave the power unto the beast." Revelation 20 verse 2, just there to remind you that the dragon is Satan. So here we notice the type and antitype. For both of them, the origin of the doctrine was Satan, both in Revelation 2 and in Revelation 13. Well, maybe that doesn't tell us much, so let's continue by looking at some of the other concepts. Revelation 2, verse 22 and 23. "Except they repent," Christ says, "of their deeds, I will kill her children with death." Notice that Christ is speaking here. He says if they do not repent, he will kill them with death. What do we find in Revelation 13, verse 15? Of course, we find something similar. "As many as who would not worship the image of the beast should be killed." Of course, we remember when we think back of the second lesson and the Daniel 3 and Revelation 13, when there was a type antitype, that, and it was the casting into the fiery furnace being compared also with this particular verse, that the children of God are threatened with death during Revelation 13's time period, and again also in Daniel 3. However, when God in Revelation 2 promises death, God doesn't threaten, God carries out his promises. But let's then have a look at the type antitype again of these two, and have a look. Not only did the doctrine originate from Satan, but also in both cases there is a death penalty involved in both of these pieces. Let's scratch a little bit deeper. Revelation 2 verse 20. I have a few things against thee, because thou sufferest that woman Jezebel to teach my servants to commit fornication. And what do we find when we look at Revelation, just a piece after Revelation 13? Remember, the Bible was not written in chapters. This is still part of the Revelation 13 and 14 that was written together. It says, and there followed another angel saying, Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of what? Of her fornication. Yes? In both passages, we start having this concept. If we, just to show you there the combination, it's Revelation 2 on the one side, Revelation 13, 15 on the other side, but Revelation 13 and 14 is all forming part of the same story, the same concept over there. And if you go through those verses that I've got down there on the screen, you will clearly see the connection between them. So not only does the doctrine originate from Satan, not only is there a death penalty involved, but there's also fornication in both of these passages. Let's continue, and we read that they profess a form of godliness. Notice what it says in the first portion again, Revelation 2 verse 20. That woman Jezebel, which calleth herself a prophetess. Is she a prophetess? No, she calleth herself a prophetess. And then a verse in 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 4, which has a direct reflection of the Antichrist, which is exactly what we find in Revelation 13. Revelation 13 is there to point out the Antichrist. And 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 4 gives us a little hint, more information about the Antichrist. It says there, 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 4, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he, as God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Is he God? No, but he pretends to be God, showing himself to be God. So not only do we have these three concepts already of the origin of the doctrine, being Satan, that there's a death penalty involved, but we find that there's fornication involved. We find that there is a pretense of religion involved. Let's just look at those two pieces again very quickly. If we put them next to each other and we look what have we now found from Revelation 2 and Revelation 13. To summarize that portion in Revelation 2, just at one church, we read the following, and these are just my words to summarize it. A woman called Jezebel, which calleth herself a prophetess, that seduces her servants to commit fornication by implementing a doctrine that originates from Satan, and the Lord promises the death penalty for those that follow her. Notice if we summarize Revelation 13, a beast that shows himself to be God, that seduces its servants with a doctrine originating from Satan, and that promises the death penalty to those, spelling mistake there, but don't worry about that, to those that do not follow. Can you now begin to see that there's a little reflection of this fourth church found in Revelation 2 and what's going on in the heart of Revelation 13? The symbolism of a woman in Revelation 2 verse 20, a woman now starts being portrayed. The one in Revelation 2 verse 20, Jezebel, because thou sufferest that woman Jezebel. Now the concept of the Antichrist starts in Revelation 13. Of course, we also find it in Daniel, but it starts in Revelation 13 and it's carried all the way through to Revelation 17. In one of the future lessons, we will have a deeper look at the woman that sitteth on the beast with 7 heads, but that is in one of the later lessons. But it all forms part of the Antichrist. And notice that particular woman. And I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast. So, in the imagery of the Antichrist, a little bit later, also the imagery of a woman starts coming up. You see, this little slide again, you've seen this slide before, shows you just how carefully written the book of Revelation is. It has chiasms pointing to the center. The 7 churches reflect to the center of these 7 churches. That central church also reflects back to a type and an antitype of what happens in the middle in chapter 13. And of course, the lessons that we had a look at, lesson 4 and lesson 5 of the recapitulation of the 7 churches, 7 seals and 7 trumpets. And here we find the type and antitype of something which is happening. And now we're going to scratch deeper into it, and you will see an unbelievable type, antitype. You see, as I've mentioned before, various books in the Bible, the book of Esther, the book of Kings, Daniel, Zechariah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, the Gospels itself, Thessalonians, so many of them reflect to the center of Revelation, with types and antitypes. Even the book of Genesis, part of that, reflects to the middle of Revelation. So let's have a look at this woman, Jezebel, and the woman who sits upon the beast, because they are a type and an antitype. If we look at Jezebel, we will understand the other woman a little bit better. Who was Jezebel? Well, Jezebel was a personality we find in 2 Kings chapter 18. Her father was Etbal, king of Phoenicia. He a priest of the goddess Astarta. Jezebel, if we look into history, we assume, or we can gather from history, that she was probably also a priestess. And so she doesn't only call herself a priestess, but she was one, but not one of God, but one of the false religions. Why did she get married to the king of Israel? She marries King Ahab of Israel. For what reason? She now becomes queen of Israel. But she brings along various idols. Most noteworthy of them, Baal. She brings along Baal as a nice little comforter when she's married to the king of God's people. The reason for her marriage? Well, it was a very political marriage. You see, she does not accept the Jewish God, Yahweh, and she hangs on to her other gods. The whole reason for the marriage between this heathen queen and the king of the Jews was for the purpose of, well, there were basically 2 purposes. One, it was for trading routes. There were trading routes that they needed, one from the other that ran east-west, and also one that ran north-south. And so if they could sort of mingle a bit, they would become more friendly, and they could all make use of these trading routes. It had financial benefit for everybody. And also, it had further implications for both of these different countries. It gave them strong military power, and they could support each other from that basis. And that was the only reason why the 2 of them got married. Maybe we will find that in Revelation 13, the marriage between the first beast and the second beast, which we find in 13 verse 11, maybe there's also a political marriage. But that is in the later lessons, the one of the Antichrist and the one called Even Beasts Have Friends. Very interestingly, with archaeology, they discovered a seal, a ring, which they believe belonged to Queen Jezebel. This particular picture shows you quite clearly some of the markings they found on it, and they found her name written on it. And the reason, first of all, why They believe it was hers. It is larger than an ordinary seal of those days, which meant that it had reflection of royalty. Only the kings and queens had the larger seal and ring to seal their documents. And this seal was one of royalty, and her name is found on this little fragment of archaeology that was discovered. So, did she really exist? Is the Bible true? I believe that without a doubt, every bit of the Bible is true. The Bible and the Bible only. Let's take a look at 1 Kings chapter 18. What exactly happened at the time of Jezebel? We're now going to scratch into the type so that we can understand the antitype of Revelation 13 so much better. Just to highlight the main points of what happened during 1 Kings chapter 18, because we do not have time to go into it in great depth. You can, in your own time, you can read through it. It's a very interesting story. First of all, we find that Elijah stands alone. Chapter 18, verse 22, Then said Elijah unto the people, I, even I only, remain a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. So there's 450 against one. Very interesting. Poor Elijah stands alone. The second thing that we find is that Elijah is blamed as the troublemaker. We read that in 18 verse 17. King Ahab says to him, Art thou he that troubleth Israel? He wants to blame Elijah for all the trouble. Regardless of his own sins, he wants to blame Elijah. And we will see what sins King Ahab had. So, he's blamed as the troublemaker. The next point we look at, the king ignores what? The commandments of God. Amazing how that it's embedded in every single book within the Bible. The king ignores the commandments of God. 18 verse 18. Elijah says to Ahab, and he answered, I have not troubled Israel, but thou and thy father's house. How? In that ye have forsaken the commandments of the Lord, and thou hast followed Balaam. He says, no, it's not me that's troubling Israel, it's you. And he tells him exactly why. Why? Because you have forsaken the commandments of God. We look at the next point. It says, God's people stand before a choice. You see, God's people always have to make a choice. You and I have to make a choice. When it comes to God's commandments, we have to make a choice. If we want to keep God's commandments, or if we don't want to keep them, it is our choice. If we keep the commandments, Revelation 22 says, Enter, blessed are they that keep the commandments, that they may enter in through the gates of the city. If we reject it, it is also our choice. Let's have a look at the verse that gave that particular point. 18 in the first chapter 18, the first part of verse 21. And Elijah came unto all the people and said, How long halt ye between two opinions? If the Lord be God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. He says, make a choice, people. If the Lord is God, then follow him. Why do you want to follow him 95%? He says, if the Lord is God, follow him. But if it's Baal, then follow him. The next point we notice, a very strange point. The people remain silent. Look at the verse, the rest of verse 21. He says to them, if it be Baal, follow him. And the people answered him, not a word. You see, many Christians choose to remain silent when they are set before the question of whether or not they want to follow God or not. The next point we look at was there was an all-consuming fire that falls from heaven. You know the story very well, so we go through that verse quickly. Verse 38, then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt sacrifice. And did it just consume the burnt sacrifice? No. And the wood and the stones and the dust, and it licked up the water that was in the trench. Even though 12 large containers of water were poured over this sacrifice, it even consumed the water. It consumed the stones. So it's an all-consuming fire which cannot be quenched, that cannot be stopped, and cannot be, when God sends a fire, it will serve its purpose. No man can stop that. One of the final points that we look at, everyone bows down and confesses God. That's very interesting. Let's look at that verse. 18 verse 39. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and they said, the Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is the God. See, there comes a time when all will bow down and admit that the Lord is God. The last point that we have there, the false prophets are destroyed. If we look at the verse there, it says in verse 40, He commands them, He says, let none of them escape. And they took them and they slew them. Not only was it the 450 prophets of Baal, if you read the complete story in 1 Kings chapter 18, you will notice there were other prophets also, and all of them were slain. Now, let's take a look if this forms a reflection. If we can start looking at the type and the antitype of chapter 2 and chapter 13. What do we find? And now we're going to go in reverse order with them. First of all, at the end of the whole story of chapter 13, which continues through to the later chapters, all the false prophets are destroyed. We look at the verse. We find that particular piece in chapter 19, just before we have the beautiful story of the New Jerusalem, the one that we will also speak about in our final lecture in the series. Chapter 19, verse 20, and the beast was taken, and with him the false prophets that wrought miracles before him. And if we go through to the end of that verse, it says, these both were cast alive into the lake of fire, burning with brimstone. What happens to the false prophets? What is the end of the false prophet? There is this way that seems right unto a man, but the end thereof is destruction. False prophets will end in hell fire. What was that second last point? Everyone bows down and confesses to God. Have a look what Isaiah promises in chapter 45, verse 22 and 23. He says, look unto me, and be ye saved, all the ends of the earth. For I am a God, and there is none else. I have sworn by myself, listen, that unto me every knee shall bow, and every tongue shall swear. In Romans 14, verse 11, we find a quotation very similar. Paul writes there, for it is written, as I live, saith the Lord, that every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God. The moment will come when every knee shall bow, and every tongue shall confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. However, it may be too late. You see, the devil, the Bible tells us that the devil, Satan, knows the truth, but he just shudders at it. And when it is too late, when Christ comes on the clouds of heaven, and later on after the millennium, when the New Jerusalem ascends down, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess when they see God arriving in His majesty and power. They will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. Let's look at the third last example that we had. An all-consuming fire falls from heaven. Of course, in Revelation 20, verse 9 and 10, we find a description, and fire came down from God and out of heaven and devoured them. And the devil that deceived them was cast into the lake of the fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are. Okay? So, a fire comes down from heaven, exact same as in the type and the antitype. Now, the middle two we are quickly going to skip for a moment, because we're going to discover that even within the type and antitype, we even have yet another chiasm, another reflection. So let's then just skip those middle two for the moment and continue with the third one that we had. The king ignores the commandments of God. The king ignores the commandments of God. What does it say in Revelation 12, verse 17? And the dragon was wroth with the woman and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God. The kings of this earth go and make war with those that keep the commandments of God. That's in Revelation. I thought that so many people tell me that the commandments are no longer valid after Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And yet, in the middle of Revelation, we find that they're still making war with those that keep the commandments of God. The Antichrist, those that in the group that you don't want to be with. So the commandments of God still play a very important role. Elijah is blamed as a troublemaker. Will God's commandment-keeping people be blamed as troublemakers? Well, the accuser of the brethren in Revelation 12, verse 10, is always around and blaming God's people for things that they are not guilty of. Our first point that we had, Elijah stands alone. Among so many people, it was only Elijah. When we looked at the type and antitype of Daniel 3 and Revelation 13, how many in Revelation 3 stood for what was right? How many of them refused to bow the knee? How many refused to break the commandments of God? Only 3. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The rest of Israel, including possibly the king of Israel, bowed down in front of that image. And here again, Elijah stood alone. So while they stood alone, what do we find in Revelation 12, verse 17? It says he's making war with the remnant. There's only a small piece, only a small group that still keep the commandments of God. We continually find that even in Isaiah. As you read Isaiah chapter 1 and chapter 2, you find that God says there was only a very small remnant. A very small remnant. 3 adjectives to describe how small it can be. A very small remnant. And in Revelation again, there will only be a remnant that keeps the commandments of God. Now we will notice within his main points, those 2 little points that we skipped, that it forms a chiasm down to the center for those 2 little points. God's people stand before a choice, and yet we find the point they remain silent. Let's have a little bit deeper look into this final part of our chiasm and type and antitype. Joshua 24, verse 15. And if it seem evil unto you to serve the Lord, choose you this day whom ye will serve. But what does Joshua say? As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Joshua gives the nation of Israel a choice. He says, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. He says, you must choose this day whom you want to serve. However, in Joshua, we find that most of the people in unity, in verse 16, answer. It says, and the people answered and said, God forbid that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. This was a good moment. This was a moment when they were still trusting God. And immediately as one man they say, God forbid, and we will serve no other gods. Sadly, history proved that they had a very short memory. But in Elijah's situation, it was a little bit different, because time had maybe taught them that it's easier to follow the wrong path. When we look at those two verses, we are again confronted with the simplicity of two verses that merely had one little word in common. But as we scratch deeper into it, we notice that there was a similar doctrine, a similar punishment, that there was, in both of them it contained fornication. We noticed that there was a remnant involved. And as we scratched deeper and deeper, we could see that actually it was, just by the mention of that name Jezebel, it was trying to hint at a big type, antitype, which was very important for us to be able to understand. Revelation 13. Now, when we looked at those two women, Jezebel in Revelation 2, and the woman of the beast, which we found there when we looked at from Revelation 13 through to 17, we find that the type and the antitype. She was hanging on to her god Baal. The woman in Revelation, she's from Babylon. Both of them were involved with fornication. Both of them, in some way or another, represented the whoredom of what could have been a religion. So, if those two women form the type and the antitype, if Elijah is the type, who is Elijah's antitype? You see, the woman has a type and an antitype. Elijah also has a type and an antitype. And the antitype in Revelation 13 for Elijah are those who keep the commandments of God. Just like Elijah, we have a choice. We have a choice whether or not we want to keep the commandments of God. And God doesn't force it upon us. But read with me in 1 Kings 18 verse 18. And he answered, I have not troubled Israel, but thou and thy father's house in that year forsaken the commandments of the Lord, thou hast followed Balaam. By forsaking the commandments of God, we follow Babylon. Did you get that in 1 Kings 18 verse 18? If we forsake the commandments of God, we become a part of Babylon. Either we are a commandment-keeping people of God, or we become a part of Babylon. Verse 21, he gives them the choice. He says, how long will ye hold between two opinions? If the Lord be God, follow him. And the people answered not a word. The question that comes to me and you when we're watching this series of DVDs is, if God calls us to follow his commandments, will we answer him with silence? Will we wait till it's too late before we bow our knees before him? God is calling us. God is calling us to go back to his scripture and to follow his commandments. Elijah stood alone. And maybe there are instances, sadly, where we have to stand alone when following God's commandments. But if that is what God asks of us, will we hesitate? Or will we answer and say, Lord, here am I. Because I love thee, I will keep thy commandments, and I'll follow wherever thou leadest. Wherever thou goest, I will go. And because I love thee, I'll keep your commandments, And I'm looking forward to the day when you say, blessed are they that keep the commandments, that I can have part of that tree of life and enter into the city, Jerusalem, the city which God has chosen, and live with God forever. Thank you for joining me with this particular DVD. And in the few that follow here on, we will start finding we will make astonishing discoveries of how corrupt the world around us has become. And I pray that you will think of this lesson and hold fast. And even if it means to stand alone, that we will not forsake God, but answer Him when He calls. Thank you.